The morning sun spilled through the thin curtains of a small two-room apartment in the poorer side of the city. The smell of instant coffee mixed with the faint sound of traffic drifting in from the street below. Naomi Johnson, a single mother, in her late 30s, adjusted the faded apron tied around her waist and glanced at the clock hanging crookedly on the wall. "Jamal, wake up. We can't be late today," she called, her voice filled with a mix of urgency and tenderness. From the couch that doubled as his bed, a boy of 12 stirred, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Jamal was a bright child with an innocent smile, but the tiredness etched on his young face spoke volumes about the struggles he had faced at such an early age. His father had left years ago, leaving Naomi to raise him alone. Life had been a string of small battles, stretching every dollar, dodging eviction notices, and making sacrifices so Jamal wouldn't feel the weight of poverty as heavily as she did. But today was different. Today, Naomi had been called to work as a housekeeper for one of the wealthiest families in the city, the Morgan family. The job wasn't permanent yet. It was more of a trial, a see-if-you-can-handle-the-workload kind of opportunity. She had been warned. The Morgans were not just rich. They were demanding, meticulous, and above all, private. Naomi knew she couldn't afford to make mistakes. If she impressed them, this job could change everything. Steady income, stability, maybe even savings for Jamal's education. But she had a problem. Schools were closed that week due to a teacher's strike, and she had no one to look after Jamal. As Jamal shuffled into the tiny kitchen, clutching his worn-out backpack, he noticed his mother's worried face. "Mom, I'll be fine. I'll just stay in a corner and read my books. I promise I won't get in the way." Naomi bit her lip. She hated the idea of bringing him along. Wealthy people often had little patience for children, especially poor ones. But she couldn't leave him alone at home. With a deep breath, she nodded. "All right, but you must stay quiet, Jamal. No running around, no touching anything, and no talking unless someone speaks to you first. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mom," he said softly, sensing the gravity of her tone. They boarded a crowded bus to the other side of the city. As the buildings grew taller, glassy, and more polished, Jamal's eyes widened. He had never seen such wealth up close. By the time they reached the gated community of the Morgans, his jaw practically hung open. The mansion loomed before them like something out of a movie. Massive white columns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a driveway lined with luxury cars. Even the air seemed different here, crisp and scented with roses from the lavish garden. Naomi swallowed her nerves and rang the bell. The heavy iron gates opened automatically, and a maid in a crisp uniform led them inside. The interior was overwhelming. Chandeliers sparkled above marble floors. Grand paintings adorned the walls, and expensive furniture seemed too perfect to even sit on. Jamal clutched his mother's hand tightly, feeling like he had stepped into another world. As they waited, in the vast living room, a man in his early 40s descended the staircase. Tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of authority, he exuded confidence that only comes with power. This was Richard Morgan, the billionaire businessman who owned multiple companies across the country. His reputation was one of brilliance, but also ruthlessness. Naomi quickly lowered her eyes and curtsied slightly, a nervous habit she had developed over years of working humble jobs. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity." Richard's eyes flickered briefly toward her, then down to Jamal. He raised an eyebrow. "And who is this?" Naomi froze, her heart racing. She had hoped Jamal's presence would go unnoticed, at least for a while. "This is my son, sir. I had no one to look after him today. I assure you he will stay out of the way." For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Richard's expression was unreadable. Calm, almost cold. Naomi braced herself for rejection, for the sharp words. She had heard from other wealthy employers in the past, but then something unexpected happened. Richard walked closer, his gaze fixed on Jamal. "What's your name, young man?" Jamal stood a little straighter, his voice soft but clear. "Jamal, sir." Richard studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Naomi, you may begin with the kitchen. As for your son," he glanced toward the study, "he can sit there. There are books and puzzles. Let's see how well he behaves." Relief washed over Naomi so strongly she almost collapsed. She bowed, her head quickly. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Jamal followed the maid into the study, his eyes lighting up at the sight of shelves filled with books. Naomi, meanwhile, hurried off to the kitchen, determined to prove herself worthy of the job. What she didn't know was that Richard Morgan had seen something in Jamal's eyes, something that stirred a memory he had long buried. And though Naomi couldn't imagine it yet, her son's presence in that mansion would set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. The first day had just begun, but the story was only getting started. The kitchen smelled of polished silver and lemon cleaner as Naomi carefully scrubbed the counters. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture cautious. She knew one mistake, one broken dish, one misplaced object could ruin her chance at a steady job, but even as she worked, her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Jamal, tucked away in the study. Was he behaving? Was he safe? The Morgans were wealthy, powerful people. They lived in a different world. What if Jamal accidentally touched something expensive or worse, offended Mr. Morgan himself? Naomi's hands trembled as she rinsed a glass. She whispered a silent prayer that her son would stay quiet and invisible. Meanwhile, in the grand study, lined with mahogany shelves, Jamal sat in awe. He had never seen so many books in one place. His fingers traced the spines of leather-bound volumes about business, history, and art. He pulled one out, struggling slightly with the heavy weight, and began flipping through the pages. He wasn't just curious, he was hungry to learn. Growing up, Jamal had relied on second-hand books from school drives and public libraries. He had taught himself to read far beyond his grade level, often asking his mother questions she couldn't answer. Now, surrounded by knowledge, he felt like he had stumbled into paradise. But his peace was interrupted when the door opened. Richard Morgan stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, his tailored suit catching the afternoon light. "Comfortable?" Richard asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. Jamal quickly stood up, holding the book close to his chest. "Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me stay here." Richard's eyes drifted to the book in his hands. "Do you even understand what you're reading?" Jamal hesitated, then nodded. "It's about leadership, about how people follow those who can see farther than others." He pointed to a highlighted line. "It says true leaders aren't just bosses, they inspire others. I think that's true." Richard raised an eyebrow. Most adults he spoke to never quoted his books so clearly, let alone children. "And what do you know about leadership, boy?" Jamal's gaze didn't falter. "My mom is a leader. She doesn't have a company, but she works hard every day. Even when she's tired, she never gives up on me. That's leadership too, isn't it?" For the first time in years, Richard felt something stir inside him. A flicker of warmth, an echo of a memory. His own mother, long gone, had once spoken the same way about sacrifice. For a moment, his mask of indifference slipped, replaced by something more human. "You're an interesting child," Richard said finally, lowering himself into the leather chair across from him. "Do you like school?" "I do," Jamal answered eagerly. "Math is my favorite. But the school doesn't have many books or computers. I try to learn as much as I can anyway." Richard leaned back, studying him. There was a spark in this boy. Curiosity, determination, intelligence. Things money couldn't buy. And yet, Richard also noticed the faded patches on Jamal's clothes, the worn backpack at his feet. This boy came from nothing, yet he carried himself with dignity. It reminded Richard of his own childhood, growing up with little before he built his empire. Their conversation was interrupted when Naomi appeared at the doorway, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Her eyes widened when she saw her son, sitting comfortably in front of her powerful employer. "Jamal!" she gasped. "I told you not to bother Mr. Morgan." But before she could usher him away, Richard raised a hand. "It's all right, Naomi. He wasn't bothering me. In fact," he turned his gaze back to Jamal. "He was teaching me something." Naomi froze, unsure how to respond. I'm so sorry, sir. He's just curious. I'll make sure he stays quiet." Richard shook his head slightly. Curiosity is not a crime. Perhaps it should be encouraged. Naomi's heart pounded. Was this kindness or some sort of test? Wealthy. People often spoke in riddles, and she had learned to tread carefully. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, bowing her head. Richard's attention returned to Jamal. "Keep reading. Maybe later you can tell me what you've learned." As Naomi guided her son out of the study, she couldn't shake the confusion swirling inside her. Richard Morgan, the man rumored to be ruthless and cold, had just treated her son with a gentleness she never expected. That evening, after hours of scrubbing and dusting, Naomi and Jamal left the mansion. On the bus ride home, Jamal's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Mom, Mr. Morgan talked to me. He asked me about leadership, and I told him about you." He listened. "To me?" "Mom." "He really listened." Naomi forced a tired smile, though worry gnawed at her. "That's nice, baby. But remember, he's your mom's boss." "Don't get too comfortable." Jamal frowned. "Why not? He wasn't mean. He was different. I think he liked me." Naomi gazed out the bus window at the city lights flickering against the dark sky. She wanted to believe her son, but experience had taught her otherwise. The rich didn't get attached to people like them. At the end of the day, she was just a housekeeper, and Jamal was just her son. But deep inside, she couldn't deny the truth. Richard Morgan had looked at Jamal differently, as though he saw something familiar, something that unsettled her in ways she couldn't yet explain. What Naomi didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Richard Morgan's gesture today was small, but it was the first step toward a bond that would challenge everything she believed about class, privilege, and family. And soon the true reason behind Richard's unexpected kindness would begin to reveal itself. The next morning, Naomi dressed in her cleanest uniform, her hands trembling as she buttoned the front. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Richard had looked at Jamal the day before. It wasn't disapproval. It was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Interest. But she didn't want to mistake politeness for kindness. As she packed a small sandwich for Jamal's lunch, she whispered firmly, "Remember, baby, you need to stay quiet today. Yesterday was unusual. Don't expect Mr. Morgan to always be so patient." Jamal nodded but couldn't hide the excitement in his eyes. "Mom, he asked me to read more. What if he asks me again today?" Naomi sighed, torn between pride and fear. "Then answer respectfully. But don't push yourself forward. Rich people don't like being challenged." But Jamal's young heart was full of optimism. He didn't see Richard Morgan as a powerful billionaire. He saw him as a man who had listened, truly listened. And that, to a child, was worth more than money. When they arrived at the mansion, the day began as usual. Naomi was sent to polish the silverware while Jamal sat quietly in the study with another heavy book. He was so absorbed in the text that he didn't hear the faint voices in the hallway. Richard had guests, business partners dressed in sleek suits. They were touring the house before an important meeting, and the study was one of the rooms Richard wanted to show off. As the door swung open, Jamal looked up, startled. The room filled with tall men whose eyes quickly fell on him. One of them frowned. "Richard, who's this? A servant's boy?" Naomi, who had been dusting nearby, rushed in, her face pale. I'm so sorry, sir. He's my son. He'll leave right away." But before she could usher Jamal out, Richard spoke. "He's fine. He's been reading." The men chuckled. One of them, a broad-shouldered executive with a smug grin, sneered, "Reading? What could a child like him possibly understand in here?" Jamal's cheeks flushed. He wanted to shrink, to disappear. But something inside him pushed back. He lifted the book he had been studying. "It's about economics. It says the value of something isn't just what people pay for it. It's also about how much it changes lives." The room went silent. The executives exchanged surprised looks. One of them even raised his eyebrows in amusement. "And you think you understand economics, boy?" Jamal swallowed nervously but held his ground. "Not everything, but I understand that money doesn't mean anything if you don't use it to help people. My mom, she doesn't have much, but she still shares with our neighbors when they're hungry. That's real value." Naomi's heart nearly stopped. "Jamal," she whispered sharply, tugging at his sleeve. She feared he had gone too far. But Richard didn't scold him. In fact, something rare happened. He smiled. Not a polite business smile, but a small, genuine curve of his lips. "Well said," Richard remarked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Better insight than some adults I know." The smug executive shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed. The others chuckled softly, trying to mask their surprise. Richard placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Why don't you wait in the garden for a while? The fresh air will do you good." Jamal nodded and slipped out of the room, clutching his backpack tightly. Naomi followed him into the hallway, her face burning with worry. "Jamal, what were you thinking, speaking to them like that? You could have ruined everything." "But Mom," Jamal protested, "I wasn't being rude. I was just answering their question." Naomi sighed heavily, pressing her hand against her forehead. She wanted to protect him from disappointment, from rejection. Yet a small part of her swelled with pride. Her son had spoken with courage, with wisdom beyond his years. Inside the study, after the boy left, one of the men turned to Richard. "Interesting kid. Sharp tongue. Reminds me of you when you were young." Richard said nothing at first, staring at the door Jamal had exited through. His mind was far away, back in a time when he himself had been underestimated, dismissed, and mocked for daring to dream beyond his station. Finally, he replied, "He's more than interesting. He sees things differently. That's rare." The meeting went on, but Richard's thoughts kept circling back to Jamal. The boy's words about money, value, and helping others echoed louder than any corporate strategy. That evening, as Naomi and Jamal prepared to leave, Richard stopped them at the grand entrance. "Naomi," he said firmly, "your son is welcome here, every day. He can use the study or the garden. Consider it part of your arrangement." Naomi froze, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Sir, that's very generous, but I don't want him to be a burden." Richard's gaze softened slightly. "He won't be. He has potential. Don't waste it." Naomi's eyes burned with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. She bowed her head. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Truly." As they walked back to the bus stop, Jamal beamed. "See, Mom? He likes me. He even said I can come back every day." Naomi squeezed his hand tightly, torn between gratitude and unease. She couldn't deny that Richard's gesture was kind, far kinder than she had expected. But why? What was it about her son that drew the attention of a man who usually kept his world so carefully closed? Little did she know, Richard Morgan was already asking himself the same question. And the answers, buried deep in his past, were about to surface in ways none of them could predict. The days that followed seemed almost unreal to Naomi. Each morning, she and Jamal boarded the bus to the Morgan estate, and each evening, they returned home with stories that felt too grand for their modest apartment. Jamal had fallen into a rhythm, spending his mornings in the study, afternoons in the garden, and sometimes, to Naomi's surprise, in quiet conversation with Richard Morgan himself. At first, Naomi assumed it was politeness, that Richard tolerated Jamal only because it kept her son out of trouble. But the more she watched, the more she realized this was something different. Richard didn't just tolerate Jamal, he sought him out. She would glance into the study and see Richard leaning forward in his chair, actually listening as Jamal spoke about school, about math problems he was working on, even about his dreams of becoming an engineer one day. Naomi couldn't help but worry. The wealthy never gave without reason, and Richard Morgan, with his reputation for calculated moves and ruthless decisions, surely wasn't showing interest in her son for nothing. One afternoon, while Naomi was polishing the grand staircase, she overheard a quiet conversation in the study. Richard's voice was low. "Tell me, Jamal, why do you like math so much?" Jamal's tone was bright, filled with innocence. "Because numbers don't lie. No matter who you are, the answer is always the same. 2 plus 2 is 4, even if you're rich or poor. It's fair." There was a long silence, and then Richard's voice softened in a way Naomi had never heard before. "Fair? That's a word I haven't heard in a long time." Naomi froze, clutching the banister, her heart racing. Something about Richard's tone sent a chill down her spine. Later that evening, Richard stood by the tall windows of his office, staring at the city skyline. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table beside him. His mind wasn't on his businesses, his wealth, or his endless meetings. It was on Jamal. The boy's words echoed in his mind. Numbers don't lie. It's fair. Richard closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, memories came rushing back. He had been 12 once, too, skinny, hungry, desperate. His father had abandoned the family, leaving his mother to work as a maid in wealthy Hay. Homes. Richard had often followed her to work, sitting quietly in the corner while she scrubbed floors. He remembered the way the wealthy families had looked at him, like he didn't belong, like he was invisible, except once. There had been a businessman, kind but stern, who had asked Richard a simple question. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And Richard, with all the boldness of a poor child, had answered, "A man no one can ignore." He had kept that promise. But in his pursuit of power, he had buried the part of himself that once knew hunger, shame, and longing. Jamal, with his bright eyes and fearless honesty, had brought those memories flooding back. It unsettled him. It softened him in ways he didn't want to admit. The next day, Richard called Naomi into his office. She stood nervously at the door, wringing her hands. "Sit," Richard said firmly, though his voice carried less of the cold edge she was used to. She perched on the edge of the chair, heart pounding. "Naomi," Richard began, his gaze steady. "Your son is extraordinary." Naomi's throat tightened. "Thank you, sir. He's a good boy. I try to raise him right." Richard leaned forward. "He's more than good. He's gifted. His curiosity, his intelligence, those are rare qualities. You should be proud." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Compliments were dangerous. They raised hopes, and hopes could be crushed. "I am proud, sir. But Jamal is still a child. I don't want him to get too close, to get disappointed." Richard's brows furrowed. "Disappointed in what?" "In people like you," Naomi whispered before she could stop herself. The room went still. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with intrigue. "People like me?" Naomi swallowed hard, regretting her words. "I mean, the wealthy. You live in a different world. We're just passing through it. I don't want my son to think he belongs here, only to have that dream ripped away. Richard studied her for a long moment. Then, to her shock, he said quietly, "I was once like him." Naomi's breath caught. "You?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice distant, almost fragile. "My mother was a maid. I grew up with nothing. I know what hunger feels like, what shame tastes like. That's why I built everything I have now." Naomi's eyes widened. She had never imagined Richard Morgan, the billionaire whose name commanded respect in boardrooms, had once been a poor boy like her son. Richard turned toward the window, his profile etched against the fading light. "When I look at Jamal, I see myself. And I wonder, what if someone had given me a chance sooner? What if someone had believed in me?" Naomi's heart ached, torn between gratitude and fear. Gratitude that Richard saw something in her son, and fear of what that meant. "Sir, I don't know why you're telling me this." Richard finally looked at her again, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Because I don't want Jamal to waste his potential, and because—" He paused, as though searching for the right words. "Because sometimes life brings people into our path for a reason." Naomi lowered her eyes, overwhelmed. She wanted to protect her son, but she also couldn't ignore the sincerity in Richard's tone. As she left the office, her thoughts raced. Richard Morgan wasn't just being generous. Something deeper connected him to Jamal, something Naomi couldn't yet understand, but would soon discover. And in the shadows of his past, Richard was beginning to face a truth he had avoided for years. Jamal wasn't just a reminder of who he once was. The boy might very well be the key to who he still needed to become. The air inside the mansion felt heavier that morning. Naomi tried to keep her head down as she polished the crystal vases, but her mind was restless. Ever since Richard had shared his past with her, she couldn't look at him the same way. She had always believed the rich were born into privilege, their lives paved with gold. But Richard Morgan had once been like Jamal, poor, invisible, underestimated. That revelation unsettled her, because now, when he looked at her son, she knew it wasn't just kindness, it was recognition. But recognition could be dangerous. Jamal, oblivious to his mother's inner turmoil, sat at the long dining table with a puzzle Richard had given him. His small fingers moved quickly, piecing together the shapes with a focus far beyond his years. Richard entered the room quietly, watching for a moment before speaking. "You finished it already?" Jamal grinned. "Yes, sir." "Do you have another one?" Richard chuckled softly, something his employees rarely heard. "I'll see what I can find. But tell me, Jamal, have you ever thought about what you want to do when you're older?" Jamal's eyes sparkled. "I want to build things, big things, bridges maybe, or buildings. Something people can use forever." Richard studied him carefully. The boy spoke with a certainty most adults lacked. It was the kind of determination he had once carried himself. "You'll need a good education for that," Richard said. "Better than what you're getting now." Naomi, who had just entered the room with a tray, froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she set it down carefully. She didn't like where this conversation was going. Jamal nodded eagerly. "I know, but Mom says we'll figure it out. She always does." Richard leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "Jamal, if you want, I can make sure you get the best education, private schools, tutors, anything you need." Naomi nearly dropped the tray. "Sir," she gasped. "That's too much." Richard held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes never left Jamal. "I mean it. You have potential, and I won't let it go to waste. Think about it, Jamal. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Jamal's eyes widened, his excitement clear, but then he looked at his mother. "Mom!" Naomi's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Every part of her wanted to say yes. What mother wouldn't? The chance for her son to have a future beyond the struggles of poverty was right in front of her, but another part of her screamed no. She had learned long ago that generosity from the wealthy often came with strings attached, and she couldn't risk her son becoming dependent on a man like Richard Morgan, powerful, unpredictable, and driven by motives she couldn't read. "Sir," Naomi said firmly, though her voice wavered, "I appreciate your kindness more than I can say. But I can't accept that. Jamal is my responsibility." Richard turned his gaze to her, sharp and unwavering. "Naomi, this isn't about you. It's about him. You've done everything you can, but there are limits. Don't let your pride take away his chance." Naomi's chest tightened. "It's not pride, sir. It's fear. I don't want him to owe anyone, especially not you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. The room fell silent. Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "You think I expect something in return?" Naomi lowered her eyes. "People always do." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then slowly he rose from his chair and walked toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, powerful, respected but alone. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter now. "When I was Jamal's age, no one believed in me. No one gave me a chance. I fought for everything I have, and it made me strong, yes. But it also made me hard. Sometimes I wonder what kind of man I would be if someone had simply cared." He turned back to face Naomi, his eyes piercing. "I don't want Jamal to grow up the way I did. If you won't accept my offer for yourself, then accept it for him." Naomi's throat burned with tears she refused to shed. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this was real, that Richard Morgan wasn't just another rich man playing savior, but trust didn't come easy. Jamal looked between them, his young face caught between hope and worry. "Mom, please, I want to learn. I want to build things." Naomi's heart broke. Her son's dream was right there, waiting for her to say yes. And yet, she hesitated. Richard stepped closer, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "Naomi, sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is let someone else help." The weight of his words pressed down on her. She knew he was right. But she also knew that saying yes would change everything, not just for Jamal, but for her too. That night, back in their tiny apartment, Naomi sat at the edge of Jamal's bed as he drifted off to sleep. He clutched a small notebook where he had been sketching bridges, his dreams spilling across the pages in pencil lines. Naomi brushed his hair back gently, her chest aching with love and fear. "Oh, Jamal," she whispered, "what if this is too good to be true?" She stared out the cracked window at the city lights, torn between two futures, one of safety and struggle, the other of risk and opportunity. And though she didn't know it yet, her choice would soon become unavoidable. Because Richard Morgan wasn't a man who offered twice, and the gesture he was about to make for Jamal would be bigger than anything she had imagined. Naomi could barely sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard Morgan's face, heard his words echoing in her mind. Sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is let someone else help. By morning, her heart was heavy with indecision. She knew Jamal wanted this, wanted the chance Richard was offering. But Naomi had lived long enough to know that nothing from the wealthy ever came free. Still, as she watched Jamal pack his worn backpack with his usual notebooks and pencils, his eyes full of quiet hope, she realized she couldn't keep avoiding the choice. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard was waiting. He stood in the grand hall, dressed sharply as always, but there was something unusual in his expression, something almost vulnerable. "Naomi," he said simply, "come with me." She followed him into the study, where stacks of documents sat neatly on the desk. Jamal trailed behind, curious. Richard gestured to the papers. "I've made arrangements. Jamal has been accepted into one of the top private schools in the city. Full scholarship, uniforms, books, meals, everything covered. Naomi froze. You already did this? Richard's gaze held steady. Yes, because I knew you'd hesitate, and because Jamal doesn't have time to waste. Jamal's eyes lit up, his voice trembling with excitement. Mom, did you hear that? I can go to a real school. Naomi's knees felt weak. She gripped the back of a chair for support, torn between overwhelming gratitude and sheer terror. Mr. Morgan, I told you, I can't let him owe you like this. Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice softened. He doesn't owe me. Consider it an investment, not in money, in humanity. Jamal will repay it one day, not to me, but to the world. Naomi shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. Why us? Why him? You could help anyone. Why my son? For a moment, Richard didn't answer. He turned toward the window, his shoulders tense. Then he spoke quietly, almost as if confessing to himself. Because once, when I was a boy, I begged for help, and no one came. I promised myself that if I ever had the power, I would be the one who came. When I look at Jamal, I see the boy I used to be. But I also see something more. He has a light, Naomi. A light I lost along the way. I won't let the world crush it. Naomi's tears finally spilled over. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, unable to speak. Jamal looked up at Richard with wide, earnest eyes. Thank you, sir. I won't waste this chance, I promise. Richard's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. I don't doubt that for a second. That evening, as Naomi and Jamal left the mansion, the world felt different. Jamal clutched the scholarship papers to his chest, his steps light with excitement. Mom, can you believe it? I'm really going. I'm going to study in a real school. Naomi smiled through her tears, her voice breaking. Yes, baby, you are. For the first time in years, hope filled her heart, not just for Jamal, but for herself, because she realized that sometimes, even in a world full of hardship and inequality, there were people who chose compassion over pride, kindness over power. Weeks. Later, on Jamal's first day at the new school, Richard arrived unannounced at the gates. He stood back, watching as Jamal adjusted his crisp new uniform and waved goodbye to his mother with a smile as wide as the horizon. Naomi noticed Richard and walked over, her voice quiet, but firm. You didn't have to come. I wanted to, Richard replied. His eyes remained on Jamal. This is only the beginning for him. Naomi studied Richard's face, searching for the man behind the reputation. For the first time, she saw not the ruthless billionaire, but the boy he once was. The boy who had been ignored, left behind, and hardened by the world. And she realized something. Richard's gesture wasn't about charity or image. It was about redemption. With a deep breath, Naomi whispered, Thank you for believing in him and for reminding me that sometimes people really can surprise you. Richard glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a rare warmth. You gave him courage. I'm just giving him a path. Together, they watched as Jamal disappeared into the school, his future unfolding before him. For Naomi, it was the beginning of a new life. For Jamal, it was the start of a dream. And for Richard Morgan, it was the quiet redemption of a past. He had long tried to forget. The housekeeper had brought her son to work expecting rejection. Instead, the millionaire's gesture had rewritten their story forever. Naomi walked into that mansion as a housekeeper, never imagining her son's future would change in a single moment of kindness. Richard Morgan, a man the world saw only, as a ruthless millionaire, proved that even the coldest hearts can carry hidden compassion. This story reminds us that sometimes all it takes is one gesture, one chance, to rewrite someone's destiny. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next inspiring story. Because you never know. The next chapter might just change the way you see the world.